All right, welcome back. So we are going to pick up where we left off last time. If you'll recall, we did a little bit of an ideological overview of the Enlightenment. I gave the various definitions of Enlightenment, one from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, one from Immanuel Kant, another from Thomas Jefferson, and then we talked a little bit about the ideological underpinnings of the Enlightenment system, again from the view of paradigms, of presuppositions, of ideological and epistemic frameworks. And the idea that we talked about here is just as Puritanism had the ideological underpinning of the idea of tulip, of total depravity of man, if you believe in man's total depravity, all of the beliefs from tulip logically follow. So too we see something very similar in the Enlightenment, which is, quite frankly, the opposite. The Enlightenment dogma, the central belief of the Enlightenment, is that human beings are innately good and that human beings are rational. And so if we believe that human beings are innately good, human beings are rational, that the world is operated on rational principles, well, we're going to believe in all of these different things. The natural goodness of human beings, as mentioned, as taken sort of a priori, but also the perfectibility of the human race, that progress is possible. And in most liberal, Whig, Enlightenment variations of this worldview, that progress is actually inevitable, which is, I think, the belief that most modern people in the West have. Not that I share it, but most, generally speaking, people think, like, for example, if you look at something like the Flynn effect, people think, okay, IQ has been going up for year after year after year after year since the 1950s, 1920s, whenever we started measuring it. And so IQ is just going to keep going up. We're just going to keep getting smarter and smarter. Processing power of computers every year goes up exponentially. That's just going to keep going up forever. GDP is just going to keep going up forever. People are the size of televisions, whatever metric you want to use. We're just going to live longer, be happier, and live more productive lives. And every generation after us is going to be healthier, is going to be freer, is going to have more social mobility, is going to be more just, have like a more just social arrangement, so on and so forth. Now, I don't really believe that. But that is the Whig view of history, is that things will just get better and better and better forever. And it's based on this idea, well, human beings are innately good, the universe is rational. And if the universe is rational and we're innately good and we're constantly learning more about the universe and we collectivize our experiences of life in this world through systems of knowledge, through science, the body of scientific inquiry, through experiments, so on and so forth, how could it be possible that life would not get better? How could it be possible that things would not improve? It would seem to run contrary to reason. If we just keep accumulating all this data, we live more and more lifetimes collectively as human beings, and we learn more and more things. And, as the old proverb goes, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Why would it be the case that we're not learning more? That's the question that I think people who share this sort of paradigmatic worldview find themselves asking in the face of the, I think, increasing numbers of people who say, this is not the case, the Whig view of history or the liberal view of history. And bear in mind, liberal not in the sense of, because I understand most of my audience, probably Americans. I obviously am an American. In the American context, we mean liberal, generally speaking, to be someone who is left of center, who votes Democratic or leans socialist or whatever. That would actually be false in the true sense of the word liberal. In fact, in the United States, the quote-unquote liberal party would really be the Republicans, because they're the party of Constitution, of free trade, so on and so forth. Not that Democrats don't share aspects of that too. Republicans and Democrats are very, very similar ideologically. There's sort of different flavors of liberalism. But the idea of liberalism is really just like the belief in the Enlightenment worldview, the belief in the idea of rights, of human rights, the belief in the idea of laissez-faire, which we'll talk about when we get to the key unit vocab. I have a PowerPoint on that. The idea of letting things be, the idea of non-intervention, of tolerance, so on and so forth. Like all these different Enlightenment beliefs are what we talk about when we talk about liberalism. And so it's not a left-right thing per se. It's on a different ideological axis. In any case, perfectibility of the human race, the emphasis on reason, deism as being the sort of religious system of the Enlightenment, if you want to call it a religion, equality before the law, and right to liberty. And remember, we talked about last time, this is understood as being sort of the opposite of what was believed in the medieval period. There was no concept of right or rights. I don't care what any number of scholars, particularly in the Catholic world, there's this eagerness to show, no. Like the medievals believed in rights just like we do. Like lots of American Catholics get very flustered when someone tries to suggest that the medievals didn't believe in rights, because of course most American Catholics believe in liberalism. They sort of what do you want to say? They imbibe atmospheric liberalism just from being in the United States. They believe in democracy. They believe in free markets, so on and so forth. And so when someone suggests that in historical practice the church didn't believe in any of those things and actually condemned them, they get very flustered. And they say, no. If you look at the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas or the theology of Thomas Aquinas, you're going to see rights everywhere. People believed in rights. It's actually not true. And we talked about this a couple days ago when we talked about reactionary thought and Ramiro de Maeztu's formulation against the ideals of the French Revolution, where he says, no, instead of talking about liberty, we're going to talk about duties. And I would say duties were the epistemic presupposition that people believed in the period prior to the Enlightenment, in the sort of reign and ascendancy of Christendom. Thomas Aquinas essentially said, we are born in a particular state in life that God gives us, and because of the state of life that we're born into, God knows in his infinite wisdom that for example, I was to be born upper middle class. Well, it started lower middle class and later sort of became upper middle class. I was to be born in that particular state in life, and then someone else was born to be poor, and someone else was born to be very rich. Someone was born to be a king. Someone was born into whatever, a family of merchants, so on and so forth. And the idea behind that is, well, you're born in this particular state in life because God has the wisdom to put you there, and therefore you have to fulfill the duties and obligations that God has bestowed upon you in accordance with your state in life. So the peasant has duties and obligations to the Lord, but the Lord also has duties and obligations towards the peasant. But it's the opposite of rights, because rights don't presuppose that you have to do something for society. Rather, it's a claim that is made by the individual on society. Like, hey, like a human right is, hey, by virtue of the fact that I exist, I am entitled to these particular things. Whereas the medieval worldview didn't talk about entitlements. In any case, that's a long way of saying this is a uniquely Enlightenment phenomena. This is a real flip from the medieval system, this talk of liberties, of rights, of enshrining them in a written constitution. This is something new in world history. Religious tolerance, also something new. All of the states, really prior to the 17th century, are confessional, are 100% confessional. And most of the states throughout the 17th century still are confessional. Obviously, you have the wars of religion. You should know all about that. Tolerance, this new idea that, hey, when we get down to the business of statecraft is actually a rational enterprise and a science like any other. It doesn't have anything to do with revelation. It doesn't have anything to do with religion. And so we can set aside religion to get down to the rational work of statecraft. It's just like saying, hey, if we wanted to solve a math problem, it wouldn't matter to me whether you were a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Confucian, a Jew, or whatever. We could solve the math problem together and come to the same solution. The Enlightenment views politics that way. The Enlightenment says, no, politics is a neutral human science. It just has to do with just social arrangements, and that can be done by way of reason, for example, in utilitarianism. And we don't need to appeal to religion in order to have a just social arrangement. Now, obviously, if you read the political philosophy of like St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, you'll see that the medieval worldview would actually say it's impossible to have a just social arrangement without revelation. And this is believed by basically every religious schema. Whether you're talking about Hinduism, whether you're talking about Islam, you can look at every religious system and they're all going to say you cannot have a just social arrangement without taking religion into account. The Enlightenment figures are going to differ with this. And then finally, just as a review, this idea of the universal brotherhood of human beings, that we all share a common humanity, that we all believe in a common rational project, and that we can set aside, differences of any type, racial, religious, ethnic, so on and so forth, to get down to the business of statecraft, of science, of civil society. And of course, this is what the American project is predicated on. And this is where we can really talk about the birth of a distinctly American idea, or at least much more so than what we saw in Puritanism. Now, the big question that we're going to be addressing in this lecture is, how is this reflected in the writing of the Enlightenment, the actual text we're going to read, which are things like the writings of Thomas Jefferson, autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, poetry of Philip Freneau, poetry of Phyllis Wheatley, Thomas Paine, a couple other texts of the Founding Fathers. We may look at some of the Federalist Papers. We just want to know, how do we see these ideas reflected in the literature of the Enlightenment? And to that end, it's worth mentioning up front, we're still not looking at literature in the sense that most people, when they go into, let's say, an English program, think of literature. Like most people, when they go to study English, they're ready to read novels, maybe short stories and poetry, but primarily novels. The novel as a literary form still does not exist. Now, you are going to get the initial novels like Pamela as an example, Rasislas, right? Like all these different 18th century, I think really bad, like Moll Flanders, Robinson Crusoe, so on and so forth. You're going to get all of these like bad 18th century novels in Britain, and they're going to start to pick up, what do you want to say, traction, start to merit attention, and you're going to get the emergence of that form in the British context. But in the American context, it doesn't really exist, and there aren't that many, like we have actually like the records of novels that are imported to the United States prior to the Revolution. It's not that many. The American readership is relatively few, and the American readership there is primarily going to be centered on the Bible, and then is later going to be centered on what we would call the text of print culture, like journalism, that we'll talk about in a little bit. But the novel is not really a literary form that takes off yet. We will start to see American novels, like Wieland and others, towards like the 1780s. Those will start to pick up a little bit of traction, but the novel as a literary form in America does not yet exist. And so the question is, well, then what are we looking at, and what makes the literature of the American Enlightenment unique, both within the period of the Enlightenment more generally, but also in relation to the British Enlightenment? Like, how does it differ? And so one of the big aesthetic principles that we have to understand going into this is Neoclassicism, which, of course, as the name suggests, is the revival of classical thought. And if you go back to the previous lecture, we talked a little bit about this when I said, in order to understand the Enlightenment and understand modernity, which is the period we're entering into, right? America is a nation that is basically founded in modernity. Like if you look at France, you have a pagan France, you have a Christian France, and then you have a modern France. You look at Spain, there is a pagan Spain, there is a Christian Spain, and there is a modern Spain. America is uniquely founded as a modern nation, which does not have a pagan or a Christian past. Now, you could talk about the Native American population, that is worth mentioning, but broadly speaking, like the American nation as it is construed in its own self-understanding is a fully modern nation. And part of the historiography of the Enlightenment is the eclipsing of Christendom, is the viewing of Christendom, as I said, as in the Monty Python view, as the Dark Ages, as people running around with poop on their heads, everybody's superstitious, everyone's a witch. It's this awful time when nobody bathed, there was no science, there was no liberty, everyone was a slave, so on and so forth. And so the historiography you see by the liberals, by the Whig historians, goes something like, okay, you have Greece, you have Rome, which is a little bit better than Greece. Some will actually say Greece was better than Rome. But the general view, you have Greece, Rome builds upon Greece, the Roman Empire falls because of Christianity. Like, for example, actually Christianity is the reason the Roman Empire falls. You'll see that if you read Gibbon, his History of the Roman Empire, his big claim, and Gibbon is obviously an 18th century English writer, he's a thorough part of the liberal Enlightenment worldview. And you see this in Hume as well, actually. But in any case, Gibbon's big claim is what causes the Roman Empire to fall? It's Christianity. And were it not for Christianity, we would still have all the civilizational glories of Rome. This is Gibbon's idea. But it goes part and parcel with this Enlightenment worldview, which is that the Greco-Roman world was really good, and it was imperfect, but we were moving in the direction of longer, of health, of liberty, of human happiness, so on and so forth. And then we get Christendom, where things fall off. You have the Dark Ages, superstition, slavery, despotism, all these sort of Enlightenment buzzwords. And then after that, America picks up where things left off in the Greco-Roman world, and we're going to revive classical thought. Now, you can see this in the aesthetics of, for example, this would have been nice to have done with slides. Maybe I'll do it in a future lecture. But I'm sure you know what Washington, D.C. looks like. If you don't, go look up, Washington, D.C. Go look at the Lincoln Memorial. Go look at the Washington Monument. Go look at the National Mall. Go look at the White House. Look at anything in D.C. that's iconic. And you'll see this. D.C., people don't ask this. I remember the first time I went to D.C., I was in, let me think about this. I was in 4th grade. My parents, they took me on this awesome vacation where we went to Colonial Williamsburg for a week, and then we went to D.C. for a week, and it was awesome. But I remember thinking as a kid, it wasn't something I could vocalize, but it was sort of I internalized it. I loved Colonial Williamsburg. It was you're going through, all these, mansions, and everybody's dressed up in the clothes, and you go to the tavern and you have a lemonade, whatever. It's this nice experience as a kid. And it gets you curious and thinking about history, even if it's a little tacky, a little capitalized, whatever. I think stuff like that is still good. And so I remember having a good time, and then we went to DC, and I was super excited to see DC. And then it kind of like hit me in an unconscious way how different DC was from colonial Williamsburg. And you think about it as like, I don't think most Americans ask the question, why is it that DC looks like something pulled from ancient Greece or Rome? Why does it have all this Greco-Roman statuary and architecture everywhere? Like, why does the Lincoln Memorial look like a Greco-Roman temple? Why is there a random Egyptian obelisk in the middle of everything? Like, why do you have whatever these rotundas that are taken right from Roman architecture? Like, where do we see all these different things? Or like the famous statue of George Washington, where he's shirtless and he's got the sandals on and he's pointing up in the air like he's Socrates. Okay, where does all this stuff come from? Like, why all the white marble? And the reason is, well, of course they're trying to copy Greece and Rome, because Washington, D.C., if you don't know, it's a manufactured city. No sane human being would ever put a city where Washington, D.C. is. It was swamp. Like, many, many, many slaves died in the construction of Washington, D.C. And the whole idea was to put a city in a place where no normal human being would put a city, and to show the American domination of nature. And through the domination of nature in this sort of weird part of the world, to show that something new is happening. And okay, what does the architecture reflect? What is the new thing that is happening in world history? It's America is going to continue the legacy of Greece and Rome. And you're going to see this later when we look at the poetry of, for example, William Cullen Bryant in The Ages. He's going to make this claim. You're going to see this actually a little bit later when we look at some of Philip Freneau's poetry. Like, there's this idea that America is continuing what Greece and Rome did, and that this project is going to be developed, and that America is something like the early Roman Republic. Okay? And that's reflected aesthetically in all the choices that are made in Washington, D.C. It's also reflected in the literature. So there's this attempt to revive all these different classical forms in literature. Now, that's not something new. That starts in the Renaissance, when we start to get all these texts coming in from the Islamic world. We start to get, particularly in Spain, the translation of Arabic texts into Latin. We recover Aristotle's Poetics. We recover, all these different texts that had been lost to the West for a period of time. Not that there was no knowledge of the Greco-Roman world, but there was a lot more after increased contact with the Islamic world. You also have a number of theological changes that lead to openness towards the study of language, textual criticism, so on and so forth. We don't need to get into that, but by the period of like the early 16th century and the emergence of humanism, you get a more serious study of rhetoric, of literature, of the Greco-Roman world. And that starts to be reflected in translations, because of the emergence of the middle class, which happens in the high medieval period, Black Death, don't need to get into all that. But you have the emergence of the middle class, and the middle class begins to learn how to read. And you have the emergence of a reading public who can't read Latin but can read the vernacular. They can read English, they can read French, whatever. And so you start to get vernacular translations in the 16th and particularly the 17th century of the Greco-Roman text. Like Alexander Pope is going to translate the Iliad. You'll have Dryden translating all these classical texts into English. And now you have this reading public who can access whatever, Ovid, for example, in their native tongue. So even if they don't know Greek or Latin or whatever, they can now get access to these texts. And so there's a sort of revival of sensibility. Starts in the English context, starts in the reign of Henry VIII, really picks up under Elizabeth I and James I, and then declines after the regicide of Charles I. So obviously during the interregnum, during the reign of terror of Oliver Cromwell, they shut down the theaters, and there's a real, taboo placed on any sort of classical aesthetic. It's like, no, if we don't see it in the Bible, it's not a legitimate aesthetic. And so there's a Puritanization of art in England for that, short period. And everything becomes compressed, right? The theater's shut down. There's no celebration of Christmas. There's all this sort of insane stuff going on. And, pressure. Well, it eventually has to burst. And so when you have the Restoration under Charles II, man, does it burst. The theater comes back, but it's like, no, we're not just going to do the theater. We're going to put women on stage, which was hugely controversial. If I end up I would love to at some point do a lecture series on Shakespeare and the theater. would be awesome, or just early modern drama. We could talk about why that was so revolutionary, but there were no women on stage prior to Cromwell, not even in the reign of Charles I, and Cromwell shuts down the theater. Charles II comes back and he says, you know what we're going to do? We're going to put women on stage. And more to the point, it's like if you were going to say during whatever, the Puritan period, we're not going to read any classical text, we're going to declassicize art, de-Hellenicize English art to get rid of the pagan influence and make everything biblical again. Well, what if we just go to the opposite extreme in the post-Puritan period under Charles II, and everybody sort of unconsciously, the Cavalier poets, just dump classical allusions into their poetry, just as a sort of like, hey, we can finally do this now. It's a sort of, way of giving the finger to all the people who persecuted them, whatever. But now we're going to get all these classical references. And that continues really through the entirety of the 18th century in England, is like to the point where it's like you get some neoclassical verse that is so heavily allegorized, where everything is, Juno did this and this is like, you can see it satirized a little bit in something like Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock, the mock epic, but it comes to a point where you're looking at poetry that nobody remembers from the 1740s and you go, like, somebody's got to stop this. It's just too much name dropping of all these mythological figures, too much allegorizing, too much focus on the generic expectations of the classical world, and not enough wiggle room, not enough freedom. Okay? Where is this coming from? I talked a little bit about that. The freedom from Calvinistic thinking, revival of Aristotle, again coming in from the Islamic world, and also the popularization of Shakespeare and Milton. Even though Milton was obviously something of a Puritan, Shakespeare and Milton become touchstone figures in the English language in the 18th century. And the idea is like, hey, these two authors formed English. That like Shakespeare's plays are something really special that are not just meant to be performed, but that are meant to be read, and that they preserve some sort of unique treasure of the English sensibility in the English language. And you also see that with Milton, that, hey, Milton actually wrote the English epic, which is Paradise Lost. His use of the language, which, by the way, like Milton wrote in Latin in English, okay? Like Milton's sentence structure in Paradise Lost is Latin. It's just pure Latin with English words. Okay, I don't really like Milton, but you see that's like the influence of classicism. Is Milton's like, what if I just do all this stuff that I could do in Latin and I do it in English? And I write a very classical genre. I write an epic for the people, which is like, yeah, that's like the Aeneid, the Iliad, the Odyssey. Well, I'm going to do that, but instead of invoking the Muse, I'm going to invoke the Holy Spirit, whatever. Okay, you see the classical influence. And Shakespeare and Milton become very popular during this period. You have all the revival of these different texts. Well, what's going to happen aesthetically is that on the continent, and then also in America, there's going to be an interest in writing in this particular way. Like I want to consume texts that are written in this intensely classical way, showing off one's classical knowledge, how much Latin one knows, how much, I can name drop all these different allusions to Greco-Roman mythology. That's going to show me to be a sort of literate figure. You'll see, like, for example, Phyllis Wheatley, the female African-American poet, former slave. We'll talk a lot about her. We'll go over some of her poems. Like, one of the ways Phyllis Wheatley tries to prove that, like, hey, I am just as good of a poet as everyone else. Actually, and the same is also true of Anne Bradstreet. Both of these female poets try to say, hey, we are just as good as everyone else. Well, how do they do that? It's by name dropping all of these classical figures. It's just seen as like, if you're doing that, you have high aesthetic sensibility. Okay? Following Aristotle and what's written in the Poetics, which there's a big revival in the Poetics as mentioned, poetry has to be mimetic, meaning it has to imitate life, imitate nature, and it should also be one part didactic, so it should be moral, it should teach you things about life, and it should be another part pleasing. And so, particularly in the 18th century, not so much in the period immediately following the Restoration, because if you look at Restoration drama, it's like all sex comedy. Like there's no morals going on until the Glorious Revolution. It's total degenerate debauchery with all the Cavalier poets. Like there's some really nasty stuff. I took a whole class in Restoration drama. I could not. My ears were burning by the end of it. In any case. Poetry should imitate life, should be didactic and pleasing. You see that in the 18th century. It's like all these sort of heavy neoclassical poems. They try to poeticize popular morality, incline the reader to the path of virtue, and there's this huge emphasis on poetry imitating nature, not doing things in verse that could not happen in nature, to not deal with things that are fantastic or fanciful or what do you want to say, that deal with with fancy, with like fairies and elves and all these sorts of things that were popular early on, like Spenser reviving the medieval tradition of romance. You're going to see Spenser dealing with a lot of these different themes in something like the Fairy Queen. Well, 100 years later, by the time we're in the neoclassical period in English letters, the whole romance tradition is gone. Like in the 18th century, you're not going to see any romances. Instead, it's just going to be a lot of epic, lyric poetry, dramatic poetry that's designed to convey moral truths and that is designed to convey nature as it is. To that end, the assimilation of classical genres, so we have odes, tragedies, comedies, satires, epics, elegies, the greater expansion and use of rhetoric, particularly in British parliamentary politics, a reaction against, numerous things. We talked about one, a reaction of sort of the medievalism of some of the early modern period that you see in someone like Spenser, but also that's like what you could call the extravagant verse, but also a reaction against the metaphysical poets, so explicitly religious poetry that is complex and that has metaphors that, what do you want to say, that are not mimetic, that are actually very counterintuitive. So you'll see this, if you know anything about John Donne, you know anything about George Herbert, Crashaw, like all of those poets are operating in the metaphysical mode, and they're very weird. So for like example, John Donne has a poem called The Flea, where he's writing a poem to his beloved, where he's essentially talking about how much he would like to be a flea, because the flea can like suck her blood and crawl all over her, and he can't do that. And he goes, well, if the flea can, imagine if the flea sucks my blood and then it crawls on you and it sucks your blood, and now our bodily fluids are mixing together inside of that flea. Well, what is you and I having sexual relations? It's our bodily fluids mixing with each other. And so if it happens inside the flea and you don't think it's a big deal, why won't you sleep with me? Now, that was before John Donne had his religious conversion and becomes a minister. That's like the young Jack Donne type poetry. But you see, that's what we call a metaphysical conceit. It's this super odd metaphor that guides the poem, where it's not really an imitation of nature. There's obviously nothing classical about it. That poem, it's not about like, let me talk about how much I know about Horace or this, that, the other. It's just this sort of witty but kind of strange verse, and a lot of it religious in nature. That falls by the wayside. In fact, for example, John Donne is not remembered as a poet. In the 18th century, people did remember John Donne, but they were like, oh, John Donne's sermons are classic examples of what? Like proper Aristotelian use of rhetoric, which is true. John Donne's sermons are phenomenal. Have you ever heard, like, for whom the bell tolls? That line is taken from a John Donne sermon. I've read a number of them. They're wonderful. But the point that I'm trying to get at here is what? This is a rejection of that particular school of poetry, which doesn't become popular. In fact, the only reason metaphysical verse becomes popular is because T.S. Eliot, the literary critic we talked about a little bit earlier when we were talking about Huckleberry Finn, he actually revives the metaphysical poets in the early 20th century. It says, hey, like people have forgotten about this guy John Donne, but John Donne's like a wonderful poet. And he's right. John Donne is, to this day, one of my favorite poets of all time. And I really, because I like John Donne, I naturally find myself disinclined to the neoclassical poetry. But in any case, what you need to know, I feel like I'm going a little bit off tangent here. What you do need to know is the reaction against the metaphysical verse, reaction against the extravagant verse, against anything operating from a medieval romance tradition, and the truthful imitation of life, going back to Aristotle, propagation of humanism, which is just sort of saying, hey, the human person is what's central, life on this earth is what's central, politics is what's central, what is decentered, religion, theology, the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so the humanists in the tradition of Erasmus, St. Thomas More, to a certain extent Dante, they try to focus more on the political aspects of the human being, and they defocalize some of the theological aspects. They're all still religious for the most part, but they're essentially saying, let's focus on human life. And to that end, of course, like, if you're going to focus more on human life, well, if you're looking at the world of Christendom, of the Middle Ages, of romance, of all these different things, and on the other hand, you're looking at the pagan world, which are you going to choose? You're going to choose the pagan world. Great. That may have been a little bit confusing, going over sort of the aesthetic overview. If you have a question, please leave it down below in the comments. I'd be happy to answer it. But the big thing that I want you to understand is what is popular in the 18th century, the period of the Enlightenment in England, is neoclassical verse. And To the extent that America participates in that, America is also interested in neoclassicism. So America's sensibilities during this period are also running towards the neoclassical. And when the Enlightenment mode of thinking takes over in America, the neoclassical is going to explode in the production of like a city like Washington, D.C., for example, or in the later poetry of someone like Philip Freneau, right, who's considered the poet of the American Revolution. You're going to see that in a lot of different places. And that's part and parcel with the fact that like the more neoclassically inclined people, the more Enlightenment inclined people in England were actually in favor of American separation. You could see this in a character like Fox, in the parliamentary politics of Fox. He, like, it's almost like a Vietnam type story. In fact, there's a great book you can read on this called The Men Who Lost America. 700 pages long, but it's phenomenal. I highly recommend it. I recommend it to all my students. And if you read the first 200 pages of that, you go, oh my goodness. The American Revolutionary War is a lot like Vietnam. Because seen from the British perspective, which is something we almost never talk about, if you see the American Revolutionary conflict from the British perspective, what's super interesting is that it's an internally divided parliamentary politics where you have like people back at home who are very much in favor of America separating, and then you have like sort of a reactionary faction that is in favor of the war, and it's sort of like a half-hearted war that where like the superior power loses just because it doesn't have the morale to fight, and there are so many people who don't want to get involved in the conflict. Super fascinating stuff, right? And then there are other similarities to Vietnam too, which is kind of funny. Like, for example, most people don't know, there are 200,000, actually, don't quote me on the exact number, I will double check it, but there are a large number of what we could call boat people who flee in winter to go to Halifax, to go to Nova Scotia and go to Canada to just say, oh my goodness, like the crazies in Boston have taken over. I am going to flee to Canada in the winter because I am terrified of the prospect of like these descendants of Puritans ruling over me, which is quite interesting, and again is not really talked about. Though you will see it in some of Hawthorne's short stories, because Hawthorne is a major critic of the American Revolution, which is quite interesting. Good. Okay. Poetry is everywhere. Family settings, broadsides, newspapers. Poetry is public, communal, and didactic. In England, poets are either nobility or they have a patron. Such a system does not exist in America. Therefore, literary industry develops. So yeah, this is true. So literary industry is starting to develop in England towards like the 1780s, but it hasn't fully taken off the ground yet. Poetry is still operating on a system of what we call encodery. And so the drama is a different thing. Drama was always commercial. Drama has always been involved in sort of the capitalist system. But poetry was reserved as, like, if you were a serious artist in the 16th century, in the 17th century, in the 18th century, you're a poet. And poets did not publish their poetry themselves. Or if it was published, they felt the need to apologize for it. So, for example, Anne Bradstreet, who we talked about in Puritanism, and I hopefully mentioned this in the Anne Bradstreet lectures, which I obviously haven't done yet. But if you're watching this in the playlist and you're watching it chronologically, hopefully this is something I did mention in the Anne Bradstreet lectures. She apologizes for writing poetry. She says, oh my goodness, I just wrote this for my friends. They never told me they were going to publish this. Now, that's probably a topos. Maybe it's probably not true. But she felt the need to go through the gesture and say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to publish any of this. This was not my original intention. How embarrassing that my poetry is published. Because it was seen as an embarrassment. It was seen as like, oh, you're going to whore yourself out to the market? What are common people can't understand your poetry? Well, who can understand your poetry? Gentlemen. People of letters, people of means, people of more than means, people of culture, of good breeding, who are part of the aristocracy. And so the idea was, if I wanted to be a poet, I have a normal job or occupation. I'm usually a lawyer. Okay, it's like a lot of people who went to the Inns of Court end up becoming poets. So let's say I'm a lawyer. I mean, I'm at the Inns of Court, whatever. I'm doing my thing. And I write some poetry in my spare time. What I do is I send out copies of my poems to my friends. And very informally, I'm like, oh, I wrote this thing. It's not very good, but I thought you might enjoy it. Hoping that they enjoy it and that they copy it and they send it to their friends. And then their friends send it to their friends. And eventually it gets in the hands of an aristocrat who reads the poem and goes, oh my goodness, this is good. Who wrote this? And then solicits the original author and then says, hey, I will be your patron. I will basically give you a prebend for life. You will get money from me every single year just to exist, whether or not you write poetry. Like, there's no quota of you have to write 20 poems a year. It's just that you write poems whenever you want. I'm going to give you money every year just to exist. And in return, all that I ask is that you dedicate your poetry to me so that people remember me after I die, so that they pray for me, so that, I have fame, so that my memory lives on. And that was the system. That was called in-coterie circulation. It was like, I didn't publish my poetry, I just give it to my friends, and we circulate poetry that way. Because even after you have a patron, you're still circulating in coterie. You just write your poetry, you send it to your friends, whatever, and it circulates that way. There was no publication of poetry, usually until after the poet died. And even then, sometimes it was like, well, we're not really going to publish this. That's kind of like that's for the riffraff. In America, that's very different. The in-coterie system doesn't exist, especially after 1780s, when we get rid of all the nobility, essentially. There's no more royal governors, there's no more royal government, there's no more royal anything. And so now that everyone is just functionally a layman, the only way to make money is through the market system. So the emergence of the literary market is something that we see as a result of the Enlightenment. We also see the emergence of print culture, okay? Because this is something people don't consider. Newspapers aren't a thing until democracy becomes a thing. There are some newspapers in England, in France, before the revolution, but the newspapers that exist, it's like, if you go read them, you don't know what they're talking about. It's like gossip. It's like gossip magazines that you see in a supermarket. It's like, oh, you won't believe what happened at this dinner, and like they ate this, and this many people came, and it's like just full of irrelevant bullshit information that nobody needs to know anything about. And that changes in the period of democratization, right? Under the Republican government, there's an idea of like, well, if people are voting, you need an educated populace in order to vote. And you already have an educated populace in the American context, because as we talked about with Puritanism, America is one of the most, at least in New England, America is one of the most literate societies that the world has ever seen. The Puritans believe, like, you have to read the Bible to be saved. Everything we need to know about the faith is in the Bible. Therefore, we need 100% literacy. And so you have, like, in New England, a very highly literate society. Their children, even though they don't believe in Puritanism, still circulate this belief that, like, literacy is salvific, which persists in America to this day. I find it so stupid. Like, the idea that everyone has to learn how to read, that like learning reading is like the most important thing, that if you don't read books, you're a bad person. That's so dumb. And this is from someone who loves reading. This is from someone who reads every single day, who considers himself to be living an intellectual life, who enjoys the life of the mind, who loves art, so on and so forth. It's like, that's not for everyone. And to pretend that like everyone has to be a reader is garbage. But I think it comes from the Puritan heritage, and I think it's a uniquely American thing. Again, going back to cultural differences, no one in Mozambique says everyone has to be a reader. That's garbage. And in many countries, that idea of universal literacy is not taken seriously. Like in the Islamic world, produced some of the best scholarship of the Middle Ages, and it was always understood that like you don't have to read the Quran, you just have to hear the Quran. And the only people who really need to be able to read the Quran and study the Arabic grammar are the scholars. Everyone else doesn't need it. It shouldn't be part of their life. If you think about how most people use their ability to read, like, so they can, I don't know, read the text on TikToks, to read news that misinforms them, to read like Facebook posts that make them angry for no reason, to read like bad romance novels. It's like most people's ability to read doesn't really make their life better in any significant way. Personal opinion, we'll put that aside. Maybe you can post a hot take down in the comments if you disagree with that. But going back to the point, because you have this hyper-literate society and because you have this Republican government, it's like, okay, well, now people have to be educated. And on a more Machiavellian side, it's like, if I want someone to vote for me, I have to convince them to vote for me. And yeah, you can do all the old-timey American stuff of like, getting them loaded with whiskey before election day or what have you. But you can also try to convince them through the press, through newspapers. And so print becomes super important. And we start to see the establishment of the journalistic industry, again, in a way that it didn't take off in England until much later, because there was just no need. Most people didn't know how to read, and there was no necessity. It's like, let's pretend I'm the most, I'm a blacksmith, and I'm politically educated. I know what's going on in England. It's a monarchy. Like, how is that going to change my life? It's not going to change my life. It's not going to do anything until I have the ability to vote, until there's some sort of representative system whereby my knowledge can actually be put to use somewhere. And so to that end, like the idea of a politically conscious public like readership or audience doesn't exist until the American context really invents it. And with that, you also get the publication of poetry in newspapers, which is the primary way poetry is circulated. Again, America and the Enlightenment really spurs on the adoption of print culture. Good. John Locke and the American Enlightenment. So this is the last thing we're going to talk about. This is another major ideological underpinning. You'll see this when we go over the key unit vocab in the PowerPoints. I'm not going to read off this per se. I actually think some of this is not strictly correct. But for the most part, it is. John Locke is basically trying to come up with a theory of natural law that explains independently of revelation how we can come to a just political arrangement. And so to do that, he has to come up with what is called a state of nature. So like, what is mankind like independent of any sort of revelation? Like if we were to just, like I always think of this as the Minecraft scenario. If we were to just put him on an island, what is he going to do? And what can we draw from those sort of conclusions? And so this is, you see this in the Second Treatise on Government. This is essentially what John Locke does and what later libertarian thinkers and Republican and liberal thinkers are going to develop, right? If you read Murray Rothbard's, I think this is in Man, Economy, and State, he gives his own variation of like the Minecraft experiment that John Locke gives to go over basically the essential theory of an entire political and economic system, which is anarcho-capitalism. Now, I will preface this by saying I am quite literally on the opposite side of the political axis. I have nothing to do with libertarianism, but I will give it a good reading here so you can understand where this Lockean view is coming from and how it's influential to the literature that we're going to read. So what John Locke basically says is, okay, you have man on an island, which, by the way, who's going to develop this 100 years later? Man on an island? That sounds like Robinson Crusoe. And you would be right. Robinson Crusoe is just a novelization of Locke's philosophy. But in any case, so you have man on an island. And what is man on an island going to do? He's going to wake up and he's going to realize, like, okay, I have ownership over something, which is my body. I have ownership over my body. If I were to say that other beings, which I don't even know exist yet, because I'm the only human being I see on this island, but like, if I were to say I didn't have ownership of my body, I wouldn't be able to move, I wouldn't be able to do anything. We would hit sort of reductio ad absurdum. And so, okay, I have ownership over my body. We start there. And we say the ownership over my body is a good. So like, it's a good thing that I have a body. So I need to survive. I need to promote my health in some way. And so after a while, I'm walking around, I start to get hungry. And I notice, whatever, there's a tree, there are apples on the tree, I shake the tree, I eat some of the apples. Then, whatever, that satisfies me, right? That promotes my survival, that's good. Then let's say, I don't know, I take the seeds from the apple, I cultivate a small plot of land with my hands, right? And I plant the apple seeds, I water it, I take care of it every day. You know, I make like one of those little like rods so that it can grow properly. I don't know. I don't farm, okay? I don't even play Minecraft, so I don't know what exactly has to happen for the island to turn into an apple orchard. But the point is, he makes an apple orchard. You know, he puts a fence around it. He essentially combines his body with the natural resources that exist. So the idea for Locke is that the natural resources don't belong to anybody. They're just there. They're not property. Property only pertains to man, and that when man combines his labor with an unclaimed resource, it becomes his. So this is a key Lockean idea. So we talk about the Constitution, or excuse me, now I can't even remember if it's in the Constitution or the Declaration. One of the Jeffersonian documents that talks about the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Originally, that was life, liberty, and property, taken from Locke, but Jefferson changed it. Life, well, I have the right to life because I have the body, and the body is a good thing. It's my property. I have the right to preserve it. Liberty, because I need to have like freedom in order to be able to acquire the means and mix my labor with things in order to be able to, whatever, take these resources and turn them into things that promote my health. And then property, because like the existence of property rights is what enables my survival. Like if any of those things are missing, my life is gone. I don't have liberty to take free action. I don't have property rights. I can't say that apple tree is my property. Well, then how am I going to exist on the island? And so the idea is, if I cultivate this unclaimed land, and turn it into an apple orchard, that now becomes my property. And the whole basis of this is that, like, okay, so this is the ideological justification of the American conquest of the New World. Because you see this in so many places. And this is, I would say, Locke is one of the fundamental reasons why the American conquest of the New World looks so different from the Spanish conquest of the New World. Which is like, how many people do you know who speak Mohawk? I can tell you, there are 900 Mohawk speakers in the United States. How many people speak Nahuatl, which is the indigenous language of the Aztecs? 1.5 million. We have like Nahuatl texts. We have like classical Nahuatl poems. We have 1.5 million Nahuatl speakers in Mexico. And actually, I am one of them. I speak Nahuatl. I'm not Mexican, but I learned the language during my time at UCLA. I took 3 years of classes in it. It was something that was very interesting to me. It still is very interesting to me. But the point of that is, like, that should show you that the Spanish conquest of the New World and the English conquest of the New World were two very different things. And what Locke gets at with his sort of view is, look, like, imagine you're settling Virginia. And you go out into the backcountry and some Native American tries to tell you, oh yeah, all that land over there that you can see up to whatever, those hills, that's our land. And it's all uncultivated because it's all just hunting land. There's no fence around it. There's no orchard. There's no irrigation. There's no anything. Well, if your conception of property is you have to mix your bodily labor with something in order to be your property, the English effectively said the Native Americans don't have property. They might have their wigwams. They might have like small plots of farms, but they can't call all of that land theirs. That doesn't add up in the Lockean schema. And so because that land is essentially unclaimed, we have every right to go take that land from them. And if they want to fight us, that's fine, but that's our land. Because it's unclaimed land and we're going to mix our labor with it and we're going to effectively take it. And if they wanted the land so bad, they should enclose it or they should develop it in some way. This is the English justification for the conquest of the New World, and it comes straight from Locke. Now, I think you can contend against this in any number of ways, but this is the basic idea of Lockean natural law. And what Locke is again trying to do is to come up with an ethical schema that is independent of Christianity. And what Locke actually says is we come up with the same ideas of Christianity from this schema, because effectively, if I need to maximize my life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and those are innate goods, I cannot do anything that is going to take away your life, liberty, or pursuit of happiness unless my life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and property are in danger. So like if you come onto my property, you're basically endangering my physical person. Because why? My property is mixed in, it's my labor mixed in with it. It's my life force and my life blood is in that fence in some particular sense. And so you hop the fence and you start taking my apples, well, I can shoot you. But if my life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness are not in danger, I'm not going to interfere with your life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness. And so this is like the beginning of the non-aggression principle, which is don't tread on me, right? You see all this stupid flags. Don't tread on me. I'm not going to tread on you. You're not going to tread on me. I'm going to do my thing. You're going to do your thing, and we're going to leave each other alone. This is the Lockean schema, and you can see this is like very much develops into the American schema and becomes like part of what it is to be an American. Just the other day, I saw one of those flags, right? You see them everywhere. The "Don't tread on me," Ben Franklin, "Don't step on the snake" flags. They're everywhere, and that's really where the libertarian tradition comes from. It goes back to Locke. Believe it or not, wrote the Constitution of one of the Carolinas. I can't remember which in 1660, and it had slavery in it, which is kind of nuts. One of the major founders of liberalism was also one of the major perpetrators of the chattel slavery system, which is quite interesting. Anyway, we're going to call it a day. I apologize if that was a little bit all over the place, but hopefully you found it interesting, and hopefully, again, no pun intended, you found it enlightening. We will continue next lecture by going over the vocab. I'll have a PowerPoint. We'll move through that and talk about some of the key terms I want you to know, and then we'll continue to dive into some of the actual Enlightenment literature, which is more interesting, I think most students think, than the Puritans. We're still not at the period of good literature in the sense of most modern literary tastes, but I think you'll find it quite edifying, and it'll tell you a lot about America. And in fact, I think if you paid attention to what I said today, you'll be thinking about American politics and thinking about our country and culture a little bit differently than you were maybe just an hour ago. Great. Take care. I will see you all around. Please do not forget to like and subscribe. It helps out the channel. I'm really happy to see that things are growing, and your comments are awesome. Please keep leaving them. I love reading them. And don't forget, check out the description. I've got 2 programs you might be interested in. One on graduating college at the age of 19, another on habits in the intellectual life. Go take a look at those. They are really good. I've put a lot of work into them. I think you might enjoy them. Take care. Have a great rest of the day, and I will see you all around.